Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our third session of today. I'm Ben Fisher, Head of External Communications at the SRA, and this session is on continuing competence. So our continuing competence, we changed the way we regulate that, and our new approach came in November 2016. Richard Williams, our Policy Associate, is going to give an update on one, a refresher on what those rules and those changes were, and two, an update on how things have panned out since implementation. Some of you may have already seen Richard speak today, but just a reminder for those who didn't, Richard's, I think, been at the SRA for over 7 years now. Has worked on a variety of different pieces of work, from our price transparency rules through to some of our maintaining standards in youth courts work, but he also was a key player in developing and managing our proposals for changes to continuing competence. So the final thing I'd like to say before I hand over to Richard is this session is being live streamed on our Twitter account and also on YouTube. So you can either watch it live on there, but more importantly, you can watch it on playback. So the slides will be up there. So if you want to be reminded of something, or if you need to pop out halfway through this session, you can catch up with it there. So thank you, everyone, and I'll hand over to Richard.
Thank you very much, Ben. Hello again to some of you. I can see some faces from this morning. I'm here to talk about our approach to continuing competence, which, for those that may not be familiar with the term, is how we ensure that solicitors post-qualification meet the standards we expect. So just before I start, can I just get a sense of who's in the room? So can I have a show of hands for anyone who's a solicitor? Okay, that's pretty much everybody. Anyone working in learning and development? Okay, the gang at the back there, and you here. And then anyone, Culp? No? Okay, yeah. Gentleman there. So what I'm going to do today is, as Ben said, is kind of give you a refresher of what we expect under our new approach, but also give you an update as to where things are with implementation and where we might be going next. But before I do that, I just want to start at kind of the very beginning and just, I suppose, put this into context, really. As a regulator, one of our goals is to make sure that solicitors we regulate meet the standards we and the public expect. I mean, that's kind of enshrined in our regulatory objectives. The introduction of the SQE, the Solicitors Qualifying Examination, which I'm sure you're all aware of, will make sure that solicitors entering the profession meet the standards we expect by robustly and consistently assessing them to these standards. But it's equally important that we have an appropriate and robust framework in place to make sure that solicitors post-qualification remain competent to practice by keeping their skills and knowledge up to date. But I think, as you've probably gathered by lots of our kind of approaches to regulation now, we want to give you, the practitioners, the firms, as much flexibility and freedom to determine how you do that. It's not really for us to prescribe what your learning and development should be. So I suppose that kind of sets the backdrop to the introduction of these changes. The left-hand side is really what we had up until the 1st of November 2016. We had an hours-based approach, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, where we required all solicitors, irrespective of their role and their function, to carry out 16 hours of learning and development per year. We also were quite prescriptive in that work. We said 4 of those hours have to be on accredited training. In looking at how we regulate, we started to look at how best we can ensure standards post-qualification, and we came to the view that actually this approach probably isn't fit for purpose, and there are 3 reasons behind that. Firstly, it is prescriptive, it's a blanket requirement. That places unnecessary costs on you as a firm and you as a solicitor. You may not need to do 16 hours. Your job, your function may not mean that you need to do that. So by requiring everyone to do 16 hours, we felt that it was putting some unnecessary costs on the profession. There's no magic science, as far as I'm aware of, or we're aware of at the SRA, that 16 hours means that you're competent. If you did 15 hours, you probably still would be competent. So it's an arbitrary figure. And we felt, well, actually, there's no real justification for 16 hours given it's an arbitrary figure. And actually, probably the most important reason why we felt a change was needed was that we felt that 16 hours was driving the wrong type of learning and development behaviour. Some individuals were far more focused on getting 16 hours by the end of the CPD year, probably on the last day, doing some learning and development in a Holiday Inn that's completely unrelated to their job, rather than actually taking time and thinking through what is it I need to do in order to be really good at my job. So, from the 1st of November 2016, we introduced our new approach, continuing competence. We removed the prescription around hours. We removed the prescription around accredited training. And broadly, what we wanted solicitors to do was to kind of regularly reflect on the quality of practice. Think about what they're doing. Think about the standard of the work that they're delivering. And in doing so, we felt that solicitors could better identify their learning and development needs. We wanted solicitors to also address those needs, so go away, undertake learning and development to make sure that isn't an issue anymore. But in doing so, we enabled you to do that flexibly and in ways in which best suited your learning and development needs and perhaps how your firm works. Importantly, we require all solicitors to make a declaration to us that they've done those things on the screen. So in essence, that's our new approach. As part of introducing our new approach, we said that after a couple of years, we'd have a look about how it was working, identify any issues, see where we're going next. So I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation just kind of going through some of our emerging findings. So we have done a review now. It's been going for about the last 4 or 5 months, and our review is made up of 3 pieces of work. We've carried out a thematic review. Now, a thematic review is where we as the SRA go and randomly visit some firms and find out exactly what they're doing. So we've 25 firms we went and visited, a range of sizes, a range of practicing areas, in-house, included for the first time as well. And really the purpose of that work was to understand what firms were actually doing in terms of implementing our approach to continuing competence. We also developed and put out to the profession an online survey. The online survey, we had 463 responses. It's not a huge amount, but it certainly gave us a sense of what was going on. And we've analysed our data. Now, the data we've analysed is pretty much the annual declaration data. We've had a look at who's saying yes and who's saying no and come up with some thinking around that. So in terms of what we found, going back to why we introduced this, it's about standards. It's about making sure that solicitors post-qualification still continue to deliver the standards that we and the public expect. From our research and our review, we found that actually there's nothing to suggest that the standard of solicitors has declined at all. There's no evidence behind that. Actually, the feedback that we've had is that standards are improving. Now, that's borne out in our thematic review. Over half of the firms we interviewed said, actually, the work we're doing now is much better than it was before you introduced our approach. And we think that's because we're of continuing competence. We're focusing on the right areas, focusing on learning development. It also came out quite strongly in our online survey as well. And actually sort of 40% of solicitors said, actually, I think the standard of my work, the quality of my work has actually improved. So there's nothing at this stage to suggest standards have suddenly declined because we've removed the prescription around the hours. I think the other interesting thing that came out was actually some firms were telling us, look, our insurance premiums haven't gone up, and our complaints haven't gone up, so it can't be all that bad. And actually, some have said our insurance premiums have gone down and our complaints have gone down. And we think it's because we're really paying our due diligence to the kind of learning and development needs of our solicitors now. We're much more focused on what it is we need to do as an organisation at an individual level to deliver a high quality work. So quite a positive picture coming out there. We also identified through our work there's actually 4 benefits. There's actually more benefits for solicitors, but these are the key ones that we've pulled out. A lot of solicitors told us it's much easier now for them to identify their learning and development needs. I think the figure's around sort of 65% of everyone we surveyed said, actually, because of your changes, I know where my strengths and weaknesses are now, and I can do something about it, whereas before I wasn't quite sure. A lot of people attribute that to the introduction of our competence statement. Now, our competence statement was introduced at the same time, the 1st of November 2016, and what that did was articulate those standards that we expect. So it's there as a tool for solicitors to say, well, actually, this is what the SRA kind of broadly expects me to doing. How do I stand and stack up against that competence statement? There was concern when we introduced our approach that actually if you remove a regulatory requirement that solicitors needed to do 16 hours, solicitors wouldn't do anything at all. Now, we never quite believe that, because actually you are professionals and you work in a business which requires you to, to do a good job, high standard of service. What we found is actually that concern hasn't come to fruition. Around half of the people that we surveyed are still doing the same amount of work in terms of learning development. That's absolutely fine. That works for them. But what we did find was that 40% of people were doing more. They were doing more than they did before under the 16 hours approach. Now, if you link that back to the first point, we can assume that they're doing more learning and development on what they need to be doing rather than just doing anything. Because if they can identify their learning and development needs much more quickly and doing that more appropriately and spending more time on it, there's a link there. So, I mean, that, again, another sort of positive message. Only 8% of people said that they were doing less. Now, that doesn't worry us, because actually, going back to the very beginning, this is about what you need to do as an individual, depending on your role and function. So actually, we did expect some people to be doing less, because not everyone needs to do 16 hours. In terms of sort of going back to that identification point as well, we found that there was a real sort of mixed approach to how solicitors were doing it. There were sort of informal ways in which learning and development needs were being identified. They primarily consisted of keeping up to date with law, regulation, practice, but there were also some more formal ways, and really the chief mechanism for that seemed to be the kind of performance development review appraisal framework. Solicitors and firms were using that as really the hook to sit down and think, actually, what have I done this year, this month, this 2 months, this quarter? What else do I need to be doing? So they were using that as really the time and the space to think and identify those learning and development needs. And we also found that there was much greater variety in the types of learning and development that solicitors were now using to address their learning and development needs. Now, again, this was one of the big advantages of the new approach. We removed accredited training, and we said, actually, pretty much anything really goes now. If you think it's helping you meet your need, and you can demonstrate that, that's acceptable to us. So what we've seen through our work is actually there's much more focus on things like e-learning, blogs, peer-to-peer conversations, peer-to-peer reviews. I suppose what you could traditionally argue is slightly more informal ways of learning are being used by solicitors. And again, we're very comfortable with that. So I suppose a message of this is, if you haven't kind of thought that perhaps some things that you might have considered may not be permissible under our approach, they are. We also identified a whole range of benefits for firms as well. The biggest one really was that 81% of those that we reviewed pretty much said there was no problems implementing our approach. It was relatively easy, and they had to do it, but they didn't really face any significant barriers. Those that did The barriers that they faced tended to be relatively short-term and time-limited, so there were things associated with bringing staff up to speed, putting in new recording systems, things like that, so they were kind of time-limited. We also found that lots of firms were telling us, actually, we've saved some money because of this. And it's not necessarily because people are doing sort of less training, although that does contribute to it. It's because the increased flexibility gives firms more freedom to think about how they deliver training. So there's a lot more in-house training, for example. It enables them to align learning and development with their business objectives. So that's at a kind of an organisation as well as team or unit or department level. So there are particular teams only doing particular types of learning and development based on their function. But I think quite interestingly, what came out from our review and what's happened since is that there's a greater sense of collaboration between law firms. Firms are working more closely together now to think about how they develop, deliver, and the type of training and development they use to address their needs. There were some really good examples of firms using their specialist expertise and knowledge to kind of go into other firms to bring people up to speed. So, and all of that was helping to kind of drive down learning and development costs without unnecessarily impacting on the quality of the standards of that learning. And we thought that's quite interesting, actually. We didn't really think that would happen, but it certainly came across as a positive for many firms. And actually, a lot of firms told us that staff morale had gone up. And again, the reason why they said that is, well, actually, the learning and development people do now within their firms is suited and targeted to the job that they're doing. So actually, it's relevant, I suppose. It's relevant for the work that they're doing. And actually, the way in which they can do that learning development is slightly more interesting now. As I said, there's lots of different ways in which that training and development can be delivered. So there's this sense that actually, people were kind of enjoying the learning and development carried out a little bit more, and that had led to an increase in staff morale for some firms. So again, lots of positives for firms as well as the individual solicitors there. But there were some areas of improvement we've identified. So, whilst it was a very positive picture, there were still some kind of risks for us to think about and address. Firstly, we found that there was a really, really mixed picture in terms of recording and development. We didn't make recording and development mandatory as part of our new approach, although we heavily suggested it was probably in a solicitor's best interest that they do that, because that will actually help them in terms of maintaining their competence. But I think the real reason is actually, and the important reason is that if we ever came and asked you, can you demonstrate to us how you're taking steps to ensure that you're competent, you'd have something to show us which you could evidence. There are some, again, really good examples, but some really bad examples of where it just wasn't there at all, or the way in which the recording had taken place, you couldn't kind of deem that someone had done anything at all. Putting a ring binder of hard copy law gazettes together and saying, there's my learning and development, probably won't wash with us, particularly if there are issues around your competence. We also found, in terms of analysing our data, that there are a small number of solicitors who are consistently not addressing their learning and development needs. Now, we regulate 144,000 solicitors. We found 35. So I think it's 0.7% of our regulated population that have at least 2 years out of 3 either not told us, either declared that they've done nothing, or just left it blank. So that is a concern to us. If you are competent and you think you're competent, that's absolutely fine. But to do that 1 or 2 years, I think we're quite interested to know why you think that. The law changes, regulation changes. What is it that, are you ahead of the times or anything like that? IT changes. So what we'll be doing is contacting those 35 individuals to explore with them what learning and development they've done, and if they haven't done, for them to explain to us why they didn't need to do it. And I think that shows, to some extent, two things really. I think it shows people do still take learning and development very, very seriously. You know, you are professionals. Solicitors are professionals with, you know, and that's borne out in some of the findings. But it also shows we take this very seriously as well. You know, we're quite prepared to go and have a conversation with people who we think aren't complying with our regulations. They might have a perfectly good excuse, or a perfectly good reason, sorry, I shouldn't presume that they're making an excuse before we've even spoken to them. But we want to have that conversation with them because we need to understand why. We also found that there were a large number of solicitors who were practicing overseas who hadn't returned a positive declaration. And again, we partly think this is down to kind of a communications issue. At the start, when we introduced our new approach, we made it clear that anyone practicing overseas was still required to do this. I'm not sure that that message has kind of filtered down to those individual solicitors. It's not to say they're doing anything wrong, but they should be doing this. So we'll be again having a conversation with solicitors who are practicing overseas to remind them that actually this applies to all solicitors, irrespective of where you're practicing. So on the whole, it was quite a positive picture, but these are the sort of areas where we think we just need to tweak a little bit in order to improve. So in a way, that kind of leads us to where we go next. We'll be publishing the findings from those 3 pieces of work sometime in early April. What we will do is probably publish quite a high-level summary document, which kind of goes into a little bit more detail of some of the issues I've talked about today. We think that's probably the best way because it gives you a sense of exactly what's happening. We'll be sharing that with the Legal Services Board because we know they're particularly interested or beginning to take a stronger interest in how legal services regulators ensure the ongoing competence. So we've got some really good stuff here to say, actually, look, we think we've got a really good balance here. We've got good, robust regulation, but giving solicitors freedom to do what they think they need to do. So that balance we feel is about right at the moment. As part of the introduction of our approach, we introduced a continuing competence toolkit. That's a whole range of information on our website which goes through each of the stages of what we expect. So it talks to you about how you might want to identify, address, record your learning and development needs. We think that's probably time for a refresh now, particularly bearing in mind some of the messages coming out about recording recording learning and development. We have templates up there, so if you are sort of struggling or you don't think perhaps your recording isn't what we expect, have a look, but we will be doing more work to try and identify good and best practice without kind of being too prescriptive. We'll give it there as a tool. You can do whatever you like with it. And the final, I suppose, kind of final way forward for us is really to think about how we can continue to kind of analyse our data. We have, as I said, we looked at the annual declaration data. There's probably other bits of data we can look at. We can look at complaints data against firms, for example, see if that's gone up or down, although it's quite difficult often to attribute whether complaints have gone up linked to learning and development. So there are limitations around the data we can analyse, but we'll start to explore what we can do. And I think importantly as well, I think there's a sense that we think we need to communicate really that the importance of continuing competence should be at the heart of everything you do. You know, it shouldn't be something that you do, 5-10 minutes every couple of months or something like that. This is integral to being a solicitor and maintaining standards and delivering a proper standard of service. And it helps you deliver your kind of your regulatory obligations. So I think there's going to be a lot more comms around the importance of this, reminding all solicitors that they do have an obligation to do it. So that's where we're probably going with it. As I said, we think it's a positive picture. We don't think at this stage we need to change anything. We need to keep an eye on it. We need to keep reviewing it. We need to keep monitoring this. We need to kind of understand best practice now in which firms do, so we can try and share that as widely as possible so kind of everyone feels comfortable with what we're doing. So that's it, I think, in terms of my bit. We've got some time for some questions now, so if anyone's got any questions, put their hands up. You look like you know. It would do, yeah. The question was really around, I suppose it's a question around what type of approaches can you use to maintain standards. I think what we're saying is, having a conversation with a colleague does count towards that. It might not be the only thing that you need to do, but certainly, if you've got a need or need to find out a particular type of information or a particular aspect of a practice, having someone who's a kind of a specialist or understands that area certainly would be viable and valid under our new approach. Mm-hmm. It's a good question. It's a question around compliance with our competence statement. Now, the competence statement is intended to be broad. It is intended to cover kind of a large range of practice. What we said at the introduction of this approach was you don't have to be compliant against everything in the competence statement because it will depend upon your role and your function. So what we're asking you to do is look at the competence statement and say, well, actually, these aspects apply to me. Am I competent in those areas or not? So you don't have to go through, I mean, you can if you want to, there's nothing stopping you, but you don't have to go through the competence statement against every single competence in there, because it might not be your job, or it might not be, some of that might not be in the realms of your job. Any other questions? Question at the back? Okay, just for those that couldn't hear, it was a question whether or not we require any evidence, the records perhaps, in terms of learning and development. At the moment, we don't. We're relying on your professional obligations, professional ethics and responsibility to tell us whether or not you've done that. We will use our thematic reviews and have used our thematic reviews to look at whether or not firms have got appropriate learning development records and systems in place. So we kind of get a sense check of it through that way rather than asking for 144,000 learning and development records to be sent to us every year, because you can imagine that's quite a task and probably a pointless task for you guys sending it in and for us as well. So there are no plans at this stage to move towards any sampling or anything like that. Question here? It's a question of whether individuals are doing more training around management skills, is that right? We did look at this, but we looked at it quite a high level. So we looked at whether or not they were doing technical legal knowledge, whether they were doing ethics. I think we did touch on management, but I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, so I can try and get those to you. But what we did find was actually that the amount of focus on ethics and technical legal knowledge hadn't actually changed too much. It changed slightly. There was a bit more of a focus on ethical training and slightly less, and I mean slightly less on technical training. So that's kind of just a sense of where the shift has been. Any other questions? Okay, thank you for joining us. As I said, there's information